Thank you all for joining us today. Welcome to the Hildebrand Project virtual book release for our most recent publication, Hildebrand's What is Philosophy? I'm Christopher Haley, the Director of Publications and Marketing for the Hildebrand Project. And we are joined today by Dr. John Crosby and Father James Brent and Professor Mark Spencer. A little bit about the book before I turn it over to our panelists. We're delighted to release this book. It was, though a relatively short book compared to ethics or aesthetics, it was probably the longest in the making. This book has had an extremely interesting authorial history. It was begun by Hildebrand in the 30s, not published until 1950 because his outspoken resistance to Nazism, his works were banned in Germany. And so it was published in 1950 in German, and then in 1960 an English translation was published that was much expanded by Hildebrand. And then shortly thereafter, another German translation was published that was even further expanded in 1967, I believe. This current work compiles all of that. And so it takes the new editions from the German, works them back into the English line by line, which was really a very arduous task for which we have to thank John Crosby and a dear friend of the project, Fritz Danish, God rest his soul, who worked on this as one of his very last projects. We're extremely grateful for that. The book has a wonderful introduction by Robert Sokolowski, and it represents the culmination of many years of work by many people. So this is Hildebrand's most significant work on epistemology. It stands uniquely among the rest of his works in giving a very robust and fundamental account of his epistemology and his views on essences and ideas and philosophical life. It's really a fundamental work in that regard. We're going to present the work today in contrast, in comparison to other traditions, and in contrast first to perhaps its most immediate interlocutor, the Kantian tradition, with Dr. Crosby, and then the Aristotelian tradition with Father James, and then Mark is going to present the work in relation to Hildebrand's personalist thought. We will invite questions at the end of the remarks. Please feel free to use the chat function or the Q&A function, and we'll try and take as many of those as we can. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Crosby, who is a professor of philosophy at the Franciscan University of Steubenville, co-founder of the Hildebrand Project, and senior scholar, student of Dietrich von Hildebrand. The list goes on and on. So thank you, John.
Thank you, Christopher.
And I can't hear you now.
You can't hear me. This is not good.
I can hear fine.
Mark hears me.
Nope.
I hear you.
Father does, but you not, Christopher.
You are not muted.
They can all hear you.
Okay, well, apparently other people hear John, so
yeah.
Well, then go right ahead.
Well, yes. But you have my written text, Christopher, so you know what is going to follow here. So I would like to introduce this work of Dietrich von Hildebrand by showing why it constitutes a major response to Kant's critique of pure reason. Kant is thought to have dealt a fatal blow to traditional metaphysics in the critique of pure reason. And von Hildebrand offers a powerful response to Kant in What is Philosophy? So let me start by looking at the famous fateful passage in the preface to the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, where Kant writes, "Hitherto it has been assumed that all our knowledge must conform to objects. But all attempts to extend our knowledge of objects by establishing something in regard to them a priori have on this assumption ended in failure. We must therefore, Kant concludes, we must therefore make trial whether we may not have more success in the tasks of metaphysics if we suppose that objects must conform to our knowledge. End of that quote. So just as Copernicus shifted the center of gravity from the earth to the sun in cosmology, so Kant in epistemology shifts the center of gravity from the thing known to the knowing mind and its structures. It follows that for Kant, the thing known does not disclose itself to the mind, so that the act of knowing is a receptive act. Rather, the mind imposes its structures on the thing known, so that the act of knowing is not receptive but productive. Nietzsche, for instance, shows himself to be a disciple of Kant when he says that the knower exercises a kind of artistic creativity. In the quoted passage, Kant shows himself to be an idealist in philosophy. In opposing Kant, von Hildebrand defends the position of philosophical realism. Now, von Hildebrand argues against this new Kantian paradigm of knowledge, whereby the thing known conforms to the mind, not the mind to the thing known. He says that the act of knowing is nothing if not receptive. In chapter 1, he explores the receptivity proper to knowledge in all its forms. He shows that even Kant recognizes this receptivity in spite of himself. In the first critique, Kant claims to tell us what knowledge really is, what it is in its own right, and this he can do only if knowledge discloses itself to him, only if he apprehends the true nature of knowledge receptively. Now, von Hildebrand's stress on the receptivity of knowledge is deeply rooted in his moral philosophy, and in particular in his teaching on the virtue of reverence, which he calls the mother of all virtues. In approaching being with reverence, we, von Hildebrand says, empty ourselves. We achieve an inner silence, and we let being speak to us, showing itself to us on its own terms. The receptivity that von Hildebrand leads with in this book is simply a kind of reverence, a kind of epistemological reverence. He works out the nature of the receptivity of knowing when he draws certain revealing contrasts. Thus, he shows that the uttering of a true proposition is not itself a receptive act. Rather, the mind posits a state of affairs when it utters a proposition. And this positing is itself not receptive. If we run together the enunciation of a proposition with the act of knowing, we are sure to lose sight of the receptivity of knowing. Von Hildebrand also distinguishes receptivity from sheer passivity. In receptively apprehending some reality, I go with the reality. He says, I actively conform myself to it. I'm not just passively exposed to the reality, but I go with it in a way that may make great demands on me as knower. Now, as a result of this inner openness towards being, von Hildebrand is attentive to the many different kinds of being, and the many different regions of being that give themselves to the human mind. He is constitutionally opposed to thinking that there is only one kind of being given to the mind, such as empirical matters of fact, perceived through the bodily senses. This he rejects as a gross reductionism. In his ethics, he explores how it is that, over and above all empirical matters of fact, values are given to the mind. In his aesthetics, he explores how it is that different kinds of beauty are given to the mind. In the work we are introducing today, he explores how it is that the essential structures of the world are given to the mind. He shows that we experience not just matters of fact, but also we experience the essential forms of things, what in German he calls Soseinserfahrung, experience of essence. This is the reward for the radical receptivity that von Hildebrand practices. He is enabled to inhabit a world containing the most various realms and dimensions of being. Now let us look a little more closely at the experience of the essential structures of things. Let me supply an example. Von Hildebrand wrote a book called The Nature of Love, in which he unpacks the essential structure of love. He shows, for example, that in loving a person, you never love just the good qualities of the person. You rather love the concrete whole individual person who has those qualities. This feature of love is not just a matter of social convention, but of essential necessity. You understand it, I understand it through a kind of rational insight into the essence of love. Now, in What is Philosophy, he examines the world of essences to which the essence of love belongs. He shows that many essences, including the essence of love, are uninventable, are strictly necessary, such that they could not be otherwise in any possible world. These essences are not human constructions or even divine constructions. When we become receptive toward them, we discover a world of necessary and immutable laws of being. In this book, von Hildebrand gives a powerful defense of our knowledge of essential laws of being. You might ask, wasn't Kant aware of these essential laws? Wasn't he talking about them when he spoke of knowing truths in an a priori way? The answer is that Kant was unable to do justice to essential knowing because he had limited our experience to the empirical observation of matters of fact. He thought that we have no other kind of experience. And he knew that you can't get from empirical observations to anything like essentially necessary laws of being. This is why he says in the quote, as we heard, that all our efforts to know reality a priori have up until now failed. He saw the need to make a bold new start in epistemology. The new start that was in fact called for was to go deep into the receptivity of the human spirit and to show, as von Hildebrand did, that we possess not only empirical observational experience, but also we experience the essential structures of things. On the basis of that experience, we can make sense of our essential knowledge. But Kant made a different kind of new start. He gave up on the idea of knowledge as receptive towards its object. He wanted to construe knowledge as constructive of its objects. He thought that in this way we could reach beyond matters of fact and reach necessary laws of being. I don't have time to explain why Kant's idealism was bound to fail. I just want to say in conclusion that von Hildebrand succeeded in the challenge where Kant failed by being radically receptive towards all dimensions of being. when Hildebrand brought to light that experience of the essential that grounds our insights into the necessary laws of being. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Our panelists, do you have any questions or comments for John? I have one, and it's not, I don't mean to apologize for Kant here, but I am struck, I guess, by this observation that what Hildebrand brings to this inquiry that Kant does not is a sense of reverence. I wonder what you would say about, I mean, I guess the question is, does Kant indeed lack reverence, or is he not making full philosophical use of reverence? One thinks of the famous inscription on his tombstone, right? Two things fill the mind with always new and ever increasing admiration and awe, the more often and more intensely the thinking them is occupied, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me, right? I mean, I guess it seemed to me that beneath it all, at least, Kant does have this deep sense of reverence, or maybe he sort of ends with a sense of reverence, but doesn't apply it.
Yes. Well, I'm not here to assess Kant's moral character in terms of reverence, and therefore not here to deny that he was quite capable. It seems to be expressed in the famous quote you mentioned, quite capable of experiencing reverence. I just want to say the idea that to know something is to bend it into conforming to our minds is as compared to the idea that knowing is conforming our minds to the thing known, is a certain objective lack of reverence in that very conception. That knowledge isn't at the service of what is, but it is in the business, of manufacturing this world of ordered phenomena that we hear about in the first critique. So I would speak, you might say, of a kind of objectified defect of reverence in that very conception of knowing, or the reversal of knowing that Kant proposes.
I think that's a very interesting observation. I do see some great questions in the chat. I'm trying to keep note of them, and we will get to those at the end. But for right now, we'll turn it over next to Father James Brent, who's a professor of philosophy at the Dominican House of Studies and an associated scholar for the Hildebrand Project. Father Brent, you ready?
Sure. Thank you so much, Christopher. I appreciate the invitation to be here and to discuss this important book, What is Philosophy? It's a great book, and it's one that I commend to a lot of people as a kind of response to Kant after the turn to the subject, as it's called. And von Hildebrand is a defender of philosophy in the perennial tradition. He definitely believes that human beings have access to reality, the capacity to know it and to enunciate necessary truths. Von Hildebrand is opposed to Kantian philosophy, as we just heard, and contemporary Aristotelians or Aristotelian Thomists are also opposed to Kantian philosophy. And so even though von Hildebrand is often critical of Aristotle or the Aristotelian tradition of philosophy, the Aristotelian tradition and von Hildebrand have a common opponent in Kant or Kantian philosophy, at least as the story is usually told. And so there are many disagreements between von Hildebrand and Aristotle, or Aristotle and Aquinas, and those disagreements seem to be to cluster around the topic of the will, our free agency, morality, and the ultimate foundations of morality. But when it comes to the intellect and to knowledge, it seems that there's much more in common, a great deal of overlap. And what I want to ask today is whether von Hildebrand's account of philosophy and Aristotle's are simply the same, or if there's maybe not some subtle differences. So let's start. I'm going to ask two questions. What do Aristotle and Dietrich von Hildebrand have in common? And then in what ways do they differ? So let's start with the question, what do they have in common? For both of them, for both Aristotle and Dietrich von Hildebrand, we can say that the object of knowledge is not invented or constructed by us, but the object of knowledge is something given in experience, or it's just given in experience. Furthermore, for both of them, the object of knowledge is an essence, or what von Hildebrand calls a necessary essential unity. And furthermore, for both of them, the object of knowledge, or this given essence, is abounding in intelligibility. And we can go further and say that the object of knowledge, or the given essence, is manifestive or self-disclosing. Aristotle does speak in a few places about manifestation, the manifestation of being and of truth. And von Hildebrand talks about essences as disclosing themselves or self-disclosing. They're almost kind of quasi-persons in a way where they're displaying themselves or revealing themselves. Aristotle does talk about manifestation, but maybe he talks about essence in a slightly different way. But furthermore, for both of them, for both Aristotle and Dietrich von Hildebrand, we can say that the object of knowledge, or a given essence, manifests or discloses many properties. And we can also say that the object of knowledge, or the given essence, is open to rational insights. It's open to a kind of viewing, not just sensory viewing. The human mind or reason is capable of more than just sensation, contrary to sensist sort of accounts of knowing, like we find in David Hume, or we just heard Dr. Crosby explain Kant's kind of understanding of sensation or knowledge, where sensation cannot arrive at any form of knowing, or it's not higher than just the sensible given. But for Aristotle, knowledge begins in sensation, but it's of more than just sensibilia, it's of genuine essences. Nonetheless, reason has this capacity to see or to view essences. And Edith Stein actually uses an expression of essence viewing, and that's a good way to think or describe this act of reason. It views the very essences of things. And so we can also say for both Aristotle and Dietrich von Hildebrand, reason is capable of such a noesis or insight into the essences of things that are given in experience. And for both of them, the object of knowledge, or a given essence, yields absolutely necessary truths when the essence is properly viewed by reason, when its properties are discovered and articulated in a judgment. For example, all morally responsible persons are free agents. That's an example that Dietrich von Hildebrand uses a lot. So persons would be one of these necessary intelligible unities, or morally responsible persons. And by viewing this essence, which is given to us in our experience, we can see that this property of being a free agent belongs of necessity to this essence. And he talks about, trying to conceive the opposite and the inconceivability of the opposite. So that the necessary connection between the subject and the property is something that reason can simply see. A lot turns on what it means to properly view the essences of things. And this is where Dietrich von Hildebrand, I think, is really just a wonderful read when he talks about reverence towards the object of knowledge, or these given essences, and the necessity of reverence towards them. And without reverence, we cannot really receive the disclosures of the essences of things. He also talks about the practice of going with the object of experience, or the essence given to us in experience. And the discussion of going with in the opening chapters of What is Philosophy are just really very excellent. You can see how he was sort of formed in the phenomenological school of Husserl without necessarily going on to accept all of the implications of Husserlian phenomenology, but kind of goes in a different direction. So this essence viewing and the going with the object given in experience is necessary to view the essence and to receive its disclosures. These things, reverence, going with the object, and receptivity to its disclosures, are really the necessary preparations for the rational insight, the act of rational insight. But philosophical knowledge, properly so called, is the judgment of a necessary truth flowing from the rational or a priori insight into a given essence. And I want to stress that for Dietrich von Hildebrand, a priori does not mean empty or trivial, but means it's possible for there to be genuine a priori insight into reality itself, something that Kant wouldn't go for, it seems. Okay, so with all those things in common, Aristotle and Dietrich von Hildebrand, it really seems like they simply share the same account of philosophy, of intellect, of intellectual activity, the object of knowledge, the act of knowledge, and the possibility of knowledge. And they both seem to be proponents of the possibility of genuine knowledge of perennial truths. They're both, we could say, friends of the forms, if we want to use Plato's expression, and proponents of the possibility of knowing the forms. And they're both heralds of good news that way, because human beings were made to know. So do Aristotle and Dietrich von Hildebrand differ? And if so, how? The differences are going to be pretty subtle, but they could very well be significant. And here I basically want to raise more questions than make statements, but I'll try to put it this way. We'll start with the topic of the role of the question on sit. Is it so, whether it is, or does it exist? For Aristotle, in order to know the essence of a thing, one must first settle the question whether it is. Would Dietrich von Hildebrand agree to that? On the one hand, it seems yes. And there's a couple of examples of this. At the very beginning of the book, What is Philosophy? He starts out by saying, knowledge is something real. We are knowers. And it's something given to us, and we're just going to go from there. So he doesn't seem to take up skepticism as really an issue. He just says knowledge is, and here's what it is. Likewise, in the book, The Nature of Love, he just says, look, love is just something that's given. And so love is, and we're going to unfold the nature of love. So going by those two works, it seems like he starts with a kind of answer to the question, is it? But it seems like Aristotle and Dietrich von Hildebrand would disagree on how to settle a question on sit, or whether it is so. For Dietrich von Hildebrand, it suffices for something to be given in higher experience, something that's before the mind's eye, or something in lived experience, we might say. For Aristotle, it does not suffice for something to be given in higher experience or before the mind's eye. Rather, the question on sit, whether it is so, must be settled either by sensory experience or by inference from things given in sensory experience. It does not suffice to settle the question of the ontological status of something just to say it's given in higher experience. After all, something could be given in higher experience, but not really be there in reality. And the famous example would be, well, universals. We have lots of universals in our higher experience within our consciousness, but Aristotle doesn't think universals exist in reality. So for Aristotle, philosophy begins in the contemplation of nature, it seems, rather than the givens of moral or personal experience, whereas for Dietrich von Hildebrand, moral or personal experience is really the starting point. Okay, so that's one way they differ. Here's another one. For Aristotle, to know is to be the form of the thing known. It's one of the famous principles of Aristotelian theory of knowledge. For Dietrich von Hildebrand, to know is to be before the thing known, like a viewer of it, enjoying its display or its disclosure. And this leads to an important distinction, or touches on a distinction, we should say, when we think about our consciousness. We can think about consciousness as consciousness, or non-dual consciousness, versus consciousness as intentional or dual. For Aristotle, the simple apprehension of things or receptivity to the forms of things belongs to our consciousness as consciousness and is non-dual. So to know or to apprehend is to be the very thing. But this very being of the thing is not something that shows up within our intentional awareness. And skeptics have always kind of scratched their head and said, where in our lived experience is exactly this being, the thing known, and this simple apprehension that you're talking about, Aristotle? For Dietrich von Hildebrand, apprehension belongs to consciousness as intentional or dual consciousness, it seems. And so he speaks of the object as before me and displaying itself, opening up itself, disclosing itself, etc. So is it the case for Dietrich von Hildebrand that to know is to be the form of the thing known? It seems not, except for one thing. Sometimes, or in the course of this book, What is Philosophy?, von Hildebrand will speak about participating in the object of knowledge. He says that in several places, and it suggests some sort of being the thing known, not just spectating on it from a distance, but actually entering into it intimately and somehow being it. But unfortunately, he doesn't elaborate on that very much. So I just put that out there as a question. What does it mean to participate in the object of knowledge? And the last point I'll make is regarding the philosophy of nature. Is there such a thing as the philosophy of nature? For Aristotle, yes. I mean, obviously, Aristotle thinks so. And Aristotle's empiricism seems to be adapted to promoting the philosophy of nature, working out the philosophy of nature, and working out a metaphysics along the same lines of a philosophy of nature. Now, so my question is this: is there for Dietrich von Hildebrand a philosophy of nature, or could there be? And it seems to me, yes, even though Dietrich von Hildebrand sharply distinguishes between philosophy and science. Still, it seems that there could be a kind of Hildebrandian philosophy of nature. And the reason I think so is because many principles of the philosophy of nature, perennial principles of the philosophy of nature, meet Dietrich von Hildebrand's conditions for philosophical knowledge. For example, every movable being has potentiality. That would be a classic perennial principle of the philosophy of nature. Every mobile being has potentiality. That really seems to be a necessary truth. Mobile being seems to be a kind of necessary intelligible unity that's given in ordinary experience. We need just a few instances of it. We can then reflect upon it and see a priori, if a thing doesn't have any potentiality, it just can't change. Or another example would be potentiality does not proceed to actuality without an efficient cause. Potentiality doesn't just realize itself on its own. That seems to be another kind of perennial principle of the philosophy of nature. And it seems like Dietrich von Hildebrand could say, yeah, those are true, necessary truths regarding certain essential unities. And something that reason can just see. So it counts as kind of philosophical knowledge, and it's of nature. So it is possible to offer a genuinely philosophical knowledge of nature using rational insight into various forms that are given to us in experience, and not just give a scientific account of nature using empirical and statistical modes of verification. So even if there could be a philosophy of nature for von Hildebrand, there's still going to be a big question, though: where does it fit into the philosophical project overall? For Aristotle, the philosophy of nature is going to have some kind of priority, and we do our ethics and other branches of philosophy in light of the philosophy of nature, whereas for von Hildebrand, philosophy of nature will be something perhaps off to the side of the real thing, which is reflection upon our moral experience and our ethics. So I'll leave it at that. And if anyone has any comments or clarifications, I would greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Father Brent. Do we have any comments from our panelists? John, I'm particularly curious if that is all consonant with the distinctions that you were making with Kant as well. And
Yes, no, I think Father expresses very well the deep kinship of von Hildebrand and the Thomistic tradition in these issues of knowledge and knowing necessary truths, laws valid in any possible world. So that I think was well done. How let's take the issue of establishing whether something is before we reflect on it. He sometimes uses this example. Perhaps you're thinking about the friendship between John and Mary. And thinking about that, you get some essential insight into what friendship essentially is. But then it turns out that John and Mary weren't really friends at all. That was a big mistake. They're really quite estranged from each other. But Hildebrand says it doesn't matter. The essential insight you gain stands undiminished. The fact that your point of departure in the concrete has failed doesn't have any negative consequences for the essential knowing that you've achieved. So I don't know if that
that's very interesting. Thank you. Yeah, that helps.
Yeah, and as for the being the object known, I think he was so keen on establishing the transcendence of knowledge that we go beyond ourselves, beyond our mind, reaching out to something other than ourselves, so that duality is really quite important to him. And he would ask, I think, questions. If you say, well, the mind becomes the thing known, what happens when what I know is something necessary, immutable, as some essential form? My mind is not immutable, so my mind would be have to corrupt the thing known to absorb it into itself. So I think his stress on transcendence wants to say, no, we step out of our minds and encounter something on its own terms. The idea that we become it is dangerously close to a kind of digestion of the form of the thing known. And that's troubling for the whole issue of this transcendence of knowledge. So just one.
Okay, thank you.
Comment there, yeah. Mark.
I wonder if I might pick up on that point about the becoming of the thing known that Aristotle and St. Thomas talk about, and just mention a key distinction I think that Dietrich von Hildebrand begins this book with, or he makes it towards the beginning of this book. So he contrasts a phenomenological account of knowledge with a causal account of knowledge. A phenomenological account of knowledge is one that focuses on experience, like how do things show up in experience, whereas causal is asking like what's going on behind the scenes, so to speak. And one way of reading Aristotle's claim that in knowing we become the thing known is that he's giving a causal account. There's a form out in the thing and I receive it into my mind. And Hildebrand could, I think, easily say that might be a plausible theory of what's going on causally, but it's not what we experience, right? And you even mentioned that skeptics about Aristotle deny that.
That's right.
So he's just interested in what is knowledge like, so to speak.
Yeah. Thank you.
we have some very interesting questions coming in. I can save them to the end so we can make sure we have some time. But thank you to everyone who is submitting questions. I'm trying to kind of organize and thematize and condense them perhaps into just a few questions here at the end. But in any case, do please keep them coming. You might use the Q&A function here. That's just a little bit easier to find them. So please feel free to continue those. We're tracking them. With that, we'll turn it over to Professor Mark Spencer, Professor of Philosophy at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota, and Hildebrand Project's one and only fellow for aesthetics and metaphysics. We're delighted to have Mark as a frequent collaborator in our work. So thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Christopher. So I want to highlight what I think is a particularly significant feature of this book, What is Philosophy? And that's the way in which Hildebrand's account of knowledge is closely connected to the reverence he has for persons. We've heard a lot about how reverence is a motivating feature of all of Hildebrand's philosophy. But Hildebrand is always concerned with giving persons their due and holding up the great dignity and value of persons. And in this text, he really highlights that knowledge is a personal act. In knowledge, we grasp reality, the reality of the sensory world, the reality of these essences, these necessary connections among things. And what we discover, if we are truly attentive to the structure of our knowledge, is that the reality that discloses itself to us in knowledge is for persons. Hildebrand frequently talks about how reality shows up as a message from God. So whereas Hildebrand is certainly wanting to emphasize the realism of our knowledge, that it's not constructivist in the manner of Kant, nevertheless, the reality that we grasp is a personal reality. And I want to highlight a couple of ways in the book in which he emphasizes this and really helps us, I think, better grasp what's going on when we know. So a first theme that he focuses on in this book for a while in his chapter on perception is he highlights two different, what we might call layers of the world that can show up for us in experience. On the one hand, there is the world discovered by science, the world of electromagnetic waves, of particles, of fields of force, things that we do not directly observe in our everyday experience, but that stand, as it were, behind the world that we observe through the senses. So that's one layer of the world. Another layer of the world is the world as it shows up for us through the senses, right? This world that we sort of inhabit in our everyday life, world of colors and tones and scents and flavors and textures, a world of persons and values and things that show up for us. And Hildebrand grants that there's a sense in which that second world, the world of everyday experience, would not exist if there were not observers. Colors in the way that we experience them only show up when observed. If there were no people, or at least no animals around to observe the world, we just have electromagnetic waves, light waves, bouncing off of things. Color shows up in experience, and it shows up as oriented towards experience. Now, some people, many people nowadays, think, Hildebrand says, that the scientific layer of the world is more real than this human aspect of the world, as he calls it. Right? What's really out there are particles, waves, right? Stuff that can be described in purely impersonal mathematical terms. And Hildebrand says this is exactly wrong. It's exactly backwards. The world of colors and tones and observable objects shows up for us as much more meaningful than that scientific layer of reality, which is not to say that the scientific layer doesn't exist or that it's not worth investigating. It certainly is worth investigating, and we can do wonderful things with our knowledge of it. But the human aspect of the world, the aspect of the world that is directed towards persons, shows up as much more meaningful. And we should pay attention to that fact. We should not deny that feature of how things are disclosed to us. A second way in which the world shows up as personal in our knowledge comes in our experience of these essences. So both Dr. Crosby and Father Brent have talked about how the sort of gold standard for knowledge on Hildebrand's view is knowledge of these essential connection among things. Now, Hildebrand notes that some people think of knowledge of essences as consisting pretty much solely in our ability to define those essences. So once you can state the content of an essence in a sentence, you've got it. And Hildebrand thinks this is wrong as well, which is not to say that giving a definition is unimportant. It is, but much more important is that we gain genuine insight into these essences, that we grasp what love is in itself, that we grasp what beauty is in itself, or justice, or these other essences. Knowledge is not primarily abstract and conceptual. It is a making contact with genuine realities out there, realities which show up as directed towards persons, as there for persons to know. He talks about knowledge of this sort in very intimate terms, Knowledge is an intuitive penetration of the object. Knowledge is even a spiritual wedding with the object. These sort of nuptial or sexual metaphors that he uses for this union with the object in perception or in insight. What's going on in knowledge is not just abstract conceptualizing, it is a deep union with reality, a personal relationship with reality, if you will. And for this reason, we need to have had contact with reality in order to really know these essences. I can't know what love is. I can't know its essence unless I've actually experienced love, whether that be in my own personal experience or I've entered deeply into its depiction in a novel or a film or something of this sort. I can't know the essence of beauty unless I've had actual experiences of beauty, at least in my imagination. So we need this intimate contact with reality, this personal contact, in order to have genuine knowledge. And then finally, I'll just close with this point. On Dietrich von Hildebrand's view, philosophy is not a sort of abstract discipline. Philosophy is taking this personal sort of knowledge and living it out in the deepest sort of way. It is having a sort of wakefulness, a sort of deep awareness of the mystery and the depth and the solemnity of reality. Reality is worth wondering at. And this shows up in any genuine act of knowledge, but the philosopher is one who has deeply attended to that mystery, that reverability that shows up in being. And so von Hildebrand wants us, I think much like the great thinkers in the Aristotelian tradition that Father Brent talked about, he wants us to approach philosophy not as sort of an abstract, logic chopping sort of activity, but as a way to deeply live, a way to live out this act that is one of the most important personal acts, knowing in the deepest possible way. That's what this book, above all, calls us to. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Well, we do have some time for questions. I'm glad we do, because a lot have been coming in, but we'll start with our panelists. Father James.
A quick question for you, Mark, maybe two of them. Would you say that for von Hildebrand, each one of these essences or the necessary intelligible unities is a mystery in the sense that it's an excessive intelligible? Like there's always more to know. You can never totally encapsulate it in a definition that exhausts all of its content.
I think that's right. But I'd say maybe two things about that. I think Hildebrand thinks that we can define at least the main features, maybe some necessary and sufficient conditions for an essence. But there is a sort of excess to it. But the excess particularly shows up in an important way. So I want to mention a contrast that he draws. So he contrasts what he calls notional knowledge with contemplative knowledge. Notional knowledge is knowing things about some object, right? So I can know all about love. I know what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for some relationship being a love relationship. A contemplative knowledge, though, he says, sort of starts once we've gotten a notional grasp on it. And now our goal in knowledge is not to know more about the object, but to have this union with the object, to just sort of behold it and enjoy it, wonder at it. And I think it's there especially that we see this excess. We can always contemplate an essence or contemplate some valuable thing in the natural world, even if we know all about it.
Yeah, it's easy to motivate with examples. I mean, philosophers have been talking about truth or justice or beauty for thousands of years, and they're still not done with the discussion. There's still more to unfold.
Yeah.
Here's another question. I don't want to put you on the spot, but what would be the difference between being in contact with an essence and just being the essence mentally?
So I want to refer back to what I said to you before about this distinction between the causal and the phenomenological. And because I draw that, I really want to emphasize that distinction. It's only a distinction that Hildebrand makes a couple of times, but I think it's key here. I would want to pull the two views together.
Okay.
That is, I think the Aristotelian story about forms in things, these essences that are out there in reality, coming into our minds, informing our minds, and making us, in some sense, become those objects, are a necessary condition for us coming to grasp these objects, coming to be aware of these objects. But what they enable is us to become aware, not just of what's going on in our minds, but of the things themselves.
Yeah.
Okay. John, did you have a question?
Well, I think we just have a couple of minutes for the audience.
Yeah. Good.
You want to open it up to them?
Yeah, I would love to. So thank you all again for submitting questions. Feel free to continue doing so, and we'll get to as many as we can. There have been a number of questions around a particular topic. I'll try and kind of condense them here, and this will be really for anyone. But the questions coalesce around this idea of how is it possible, or is it possible to know non-material, non-sensory things, whether we're talking about abstract concepts in mathematics or geometry, whether we're talking about music and a melody, right? I mean, of course, on the one hand, you have the idea of a joy, right? I mean, as an intelligible essence, but what about a particular melody, right? Does that particular melody have an essence? How might it be known? So how do we know immaterial objects that we don't experience in any way? I'll throw that to anyone who wants to take it.
Well, for Van Hildebrand, as for St. Augustine, there is also the knowledge that we have of the mind and its acts and the stances and commitments that unfold in the interiority of a person. There, you don't have the same role of the bodily senses that you have in other cases. That's a very significant domain of knowledge. What comes out of that exploration of the inner memory, as Augustine calls it in Book 10 of the Augustine Confessions.
I would also emphasize that for Hildebrand, there's a sense in which this insight we can gain into essences, which would be included among these immaterial things, is a sort of perception. Right? We can train our minds so that we are better at seeing what things are. And once we've done that, especially if we're particularly well trained in a particular domain of being, a particular kind of essence, we're going to be much better at figuring things out about other essences in that domain. So if I'm good at math, I'm going to be able to gain rational insights into other mathematical objects, even if I haven't had any concrete experience of them. Right? So mathematicians, talk about these higher dimensional geometrical figures, 5, 6, 7 n-dimensional figures. They can gain rational insight into those things because they are, as it were, attuned to perceiving that domain of being, on Hildebrand's view.
Okay. Anything else on that topic? No. Okay. We'll move along to try and get some of these. We have a couple of questions and comments about Hildebrand and Bernard Lonergan. Does anyone want to address that? So, I've what Father Brent's caveats about Hildebrand seem to be met by Bernard Lonergan's epistemology and ontology. Another person asked,
Bernard Lonergan is a very important figure and could be a kind of bridge figure between von Hildebrand's sort of account of knowledge that takes consciousness seriously and the duality of our consciousness and explores our inner life and the givens within our lived experience, and a traditional Thomistic account of knowledge that emphasizes, as Mark was saying, that really the metaphysics of knowledge, actually a causal story about how we become the thing known. And these can seem like different and irreconcilable sorts of accounts of knowledge. And Bernard Lonergan is someone who's familiar, I think, with both and is doing something that can stand like in a place between, so to speak. So actually, I have been reading Lonergan lately, and some of my remarks were a little bit inspired by his considerations. So that's an astute commenter.
A couple other figures people ask about. John, I think you might have something to say on this. Is John Henry Newman's illative sense similar to Hildebrand's concept of perception?
Well, let's see. The illative sense is something quite different from this essential insight that we've been talking about, because the illative sense exercises itself in concrete, historical subject matter. So the illative sense looks into history and asks whether this historical record is plausible and believable, and the mind is able to sum up many things. Or there's the famous example Newman himself gives of the claim that the Aeneid of Virgil was a forgery produced by the monks who did the transcribing in the Middle Ages. There is no Aeneid of Virgil. And so he says you employ your illative sense there to consider whether that's believable, whether the medieval monks could have done that kind of thing. But it's a deliberation, Newman's illative sense, that unfolds altogether in the concrete. And that's in contrast to this essential insight, which refers to what holds universally and in principle. So the illative sense and essential insight move on two very different levels, I would say.
Okay, thank you. So we've talked a lot about Hildebrand and the Aristotelian tradition and St. Thomas. We have a question. I think you all might have some comments on about whether Hildebrand really understood Thomism and Aristotelianism very well. He notes Mikhail Waldstein's observation that Hildebrand was reacting to a degenerate Thomism and not real Thomism. Can you speak a little bit to perhaps where the differences may be exaggerated, perhaps, in Hildebrand and Thomas, and particularly on this theme? And well, I'll turn it over to you with that. But
yeah, Father Brent.
Okay, well, I'm not going to make any comments about Dietrich von Hildebrand as a reader of Aquinas or the Thomistic tradition, except to say, as far as I can tell, he did not really immerse himself deeply in that tradition. It just wasn't his area of research. And he was actually rather reserved, I think, in the comments that he would make about St. Thomas himself. He had many things to say about Aristotle, but far fewer things to say about St. Thomas himself. And it's only if we run the two things together too quickly that you can start to draw inferences that maybe shouldn't be drawn. But the big difference, there are differences, there's no doubt about it, and maybe big ones. The difference is that the Aristotelian tradition, and I guess you could say St. Thomas along with Aristotle, really takes the philosophy of nature seriously, and a metaphysics that's developed along the lines of a philosophy of nature, and does philosophy that way, and tries to give an account of all things and of human beings, human action, human agency, freedom, and morality in the terms that are laid out by the philosophy of nature and the metaphysics developed along those lines. Whereas Dietrich von Hildebrand, for as much as he is opposed to Kant, he's still a thinker who's writing after modernity, after the turn to the subject. And his starting point is more of our total experience, personal experience, you could call it, moral experience, lived experience, life experience. And he does not want to develop a philosophy along the lines or according to the terms set by the philosophy of nature, precisely because nature has been problematized by modern sciences. And so what he wants to do is distinguish philosophy from the study of nature, and then develop philosophy along lines that are independent of the the investigation of nature and speculative metaphysics. And as a result, he gives a moral philosophy that's based on a notion that he claims is not anywhere in Aristotle or Thomas, which is the notion of value. And so that becomes the critical question. Is there such a thing as value? And is it in Aristotle and St. Thomas? Is it the same thing as the honorable good, or is it different from the honorable good? And how does the honorable good figure into the moral story overall? Those are the big questions.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I think the future of the dialogue between von Hildebrand and Thomism lies in looking more closely at Thomas's teaching. Von Hildebrand knew, I think, more of these scholastic manuals than the original text of Thomas. But to look at that together would, I think, bear a lot of fruit for this dialogue that is taking off now. So
I would also emphasize I've talked about the causal and the phenomenological approach, but to see these as complementary, right? The two approaches that Father Brent talked about, especially in moral experience, as complementary approaches.
Yeah.
In the causal or metaphysical or philosophy of nature approach, we look at moral experience or knowledge or any other things as they unfold from the nature of the person.
Yeah.
In the phenomenological approach, we look at how these phenomena show up in our lived experience. There's the work of coordinating, as it were, the two approaches.
right.
But I think that's well worth doing.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the project before us.
Yes, I think so. There's in the questions on love, on amor, on the prima secunde, there's a wonderful discussion of the ecstasy of love. And it's very oriented to the experience of love, and it's altogether in line with the Hildebrandian approach. So one needs to dig out these treasures that could really facilitate the dialogue.
There are comments there. We do have a few more questions. I'm sorry to say, I think we're about out of time. Do our panelists have any final thoughts or concluding questions or thoughts, or if you saw anything in the chat or questions that we didn't get to that you wanted to respond to, please feel free to take a moment to do so. No? Okay. Well, I thank you everyone for joining us. I'm sorry if we didn't get a chance to get to your question. That just tells us we need to do more events like this, and we will certainly try to do so. If you haven't ordered your copy of What is Philosophy yet, you can do so. I just sent a link to it. And if you're doing early Christmas shopping for people, it makes a great gift for everyone in your family. Looks great on a bookshelf. You can fit it into a stocking. If you like that, highly recommended. But thank you so much for our panelists for joining us today. This book invites much further discussion as well.
Thank you, Father James and Mark. That was very
Likewise.
helpful.
Thank you.
What you all presented. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Christopher.